So my name, Jared Arnofsky. I'm a solutions architect at AmericanEagle.com. I've worked there. I've worked with Sitecore for, I want to say about 9 years, maybe almost 10 years. I don't know the exact number, but a long time. I've worked on anything from 7.2 was my first site, all the way up to, 10 in the tens, 10.2 maybe was my last regular XP. But now working on XM and specifically XM Cloud. My focus at American Eagle for probably the past year and a half or so has been headless development, and specifically this year, has been XM Cloud, Sitecore Search as well. And then some fun things about myself. I live in the greater Boston area with my wife and my 3-year-old son, and I like to collect some vintage action figures, He-Man toys, Transformers, wrestling figures, stuff like that. So this presentation, kind of how I'm thinking about it, I called it XM Cloud Experiences and Learnings, 300 sites in XM Cloud. So this project was, for like a big health organization that acquires a new location, maybe 10 locations a month. So they needed a way to add new sites monthly, create new sites, and of course they already had a backlog of 300 sites. What I started doing at work internally at American Eagle is, so once I started doing my XM Cloud project and got the ball rolling and was doing well with it, and then we eventually launched it, I started coming together with like topics and things that I wanted to share with the other architects and with the Sitecore community, of like, these are the things that I've learned and these are the things that I think might be helpful for you, to do your first XM Cloud project. So the presentation is not this is XM Cloud, this is, an intro to it or something like that. It's really made for, a Sitecore developer that's familiar with Sitecore, maybe has a little bit of understanding of headless development, but it's really just for like gotchas and things to know and things that I think might help you get off on the right foot. Just things I'm sharing internally and that I'd also like to share with the community. Just something I want to note is just a blanket statement. And once you start working with XM Cloud, you'll realize this too. It's constantly evolving. Things are changing. Things are being added. Bugs are getting fixed. You can have deployments happen to XM Cloud automatically from Sitecore to address issues. So just because I'm saying something now and I encountered it in my project doesn't 100% mean that it's going to be the same thing in the future or present. Most of the things are guidelines and things that will be true, but there might be something that could change, or it's just a blanket statement, like it's an evolving, platform. For my agenda, just a quick like architecture overview specifically of the project that I was working on. I'm going to talk a little bit about partner technical advisors and how instrumental that was to the project, what my development approach was, and what we do at AE, how we handle deployments. We'll talk a little bit about the multi-site plugin. And then the Pittsburgh user group did a really good presentation about Sitecore Search. So I'm not going to purposely dive into Sitecore Search, but I just want to talk about my approach for Sitecore Search in relation to multi-site. And then a little bit of Next.js and Vercel considerations, some talking about Experience Edge, GraphQL, static site generation, etc., and some information about how I handled the content migration on the site. So for the architecture, this is my like lucid chart, non-designer diagram, right? It could be spruced up and look a little bit nicer if I was a designer, but I'm a developer and this is my skill set. So essentially what you have here is our code lives in a repository. For this project, we're using Azure DevOps, so like privately hosted repo. And then we have our deployment pipelines. I'll get into it a little bit more in detail in a further down slide, but your deployment pipeline is essentially just package artifact creation. And then it pushes those artifacts to Vercel. Vercel is your front end, your headless application, and XM Cloud, Sitecore, your CMS. And then Experience Edge is kind of like your web database replacement. It's a globally distributed like CDN of your JSON data, of anything that would be published from XM Cloud. And then I have a little thing up top also about, to the far right, about Sitecore Search. It crawls sitemaps, and then you can use their API or their SDK, which uses their API to get data. And again, I'm not really going into detail about Sitecore Search in this presentation because the group did a good job on it, but it's just something I want to mention. And then for the sake of this project, we did have 300 sites. They were relatively smaller sites, and they had 20 to 30 components. So there's one theme. There's 6 themes that we had, and all the sites shared the same components. There's some individual content across all of them, of course, but that's the lay of the land. Like a handful of templates, maybe 20 different page types, and all the content across that. And then I just want to give a quick overview of how this works. So for any XM Cloud project, you get a partner technical advisor. So that partner technical advisor is someone that like gives you technical guidance and expertise. It's someone that's usually been in the industry, or maybe has been an architect or been in the field, like we have when we're leading these Sitecore projects. So on this project specifically, I had Richard Seal. So big shout out to Richard Seal. Thank you, Rich, for all your help. But essentially what the partner technical advisor is it's a sounding board for your thoughts and ideas. So like I could have, I'm getting thrown into this XM Cloud world, and I have some familiarity with headless. I've done some headless products in the past, but I don't know how everything works. And having that resource from Sitecore just to bounce those ideas off of and figure out your path, or just discuss things, or work through things, has been so valuable. Like there would be weeks where I'd have a couple hour discussions throughout the week with Rich, and we'd line up align upon how do we do content migration. Can I try this? Can I try that? What do you think of this? What have you done in the past? And really just like pull from their mind. Essentially, it's almost like having another architect at Sitecore that you can bother with your questions, and they'll help you out. So Rich was absolutely instrumental to the success of this project. So thank you, Rich. So one of the first things I want to talk about is just like our development approach. This development approach, I think it's worth talking about because we have this concept of a front end and a back end developer, and in the headless world, the lines kind of get blurred, and it's not really this is a front end developer and this is a back end developer. It might be this is a developer who knows Sitecore and someone who doesn't. It also, is there's plenty of people like with backgrounds like myself who've worked in like MVC and .NET for many years, and we want to work in this new stuff, and we want to learn the new things, right? And we're eager to get in there and start building in Next.js. So even though we did this for our organization and my project, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the right fit for everyone, but it worked really well, and I just want to give like an overview of what it was. So our development approach was to have our front end developers be able to spin up the local app. So you'll see like up top in the image, it says source app. That app is your headless application. So for context, we're using the headless starter repo that Sitecore provides for XM Cloud. And what we ended up doing was making a new folder. And that new folder was called UI. So essentially what we did is we had our front end developers spin up the app locally outside of Docker. So they would just go into the source app folder, spin it up using their npm commands, npm run start, I believe it was, maybe run start dev. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they were free to just do front end work and build out React components. And you'll see the secret sauce of like how we did it is up top, you'll see the example component props UI. We allow anything to be passed in through a JSX element or a string. So like this is a really simple example. It's called example component, but essentially what we're doing is we are defining the props, but allowing them to have static content within them. So the front end team does not need to be worried about Docker, does not need to be worried about Sitecore, and they can just work on building out the front end aspect of a component without, the back end implementation, and just give it static content. So then you'll see here what we did in, credit to one of our front end architects, Maurice Mann. We are using this cuts approach. So underneath the app, the source, underneath pages, the pages route, we have a cuts page, a cuts folder. And inside that, now we are making static pages. So this is just an example, index.tsx, but you'll see we're leveraging the very same component that we just defined called example component on this page called index.tsx. And you can see that I'm hard coding the prop data into it, right? So this lets front-end developers build out your components, pass in props or static values, and then sets up the backend dev this way. So then the backend developer makes their component. So this is the example component. You see we're using an alias just to avoid confusion, but like on line 3, we are importing the example component from the UI. And essentially what we're doing here on line 21 is specifically like look at line 23, 24, 25, you'll see that we are passing in the JSS components referenced on line 1. We're using text field, image field, link field, rich text. We are passing in those components rather than static strings, and then using the props that we've defined from our fields. And now this way we get to leverage the same front-end component that was built from the front-end team with static data, but we now have the ability to pass in our props data in our JSS Next.js library components, which is what we need to be able to use this thing in Experience Editor, Pages, etc. Before I get here, so so this worked good for us because the front end team in at least in our organization and on my project, they wanted to stick to front end. They wanted to build out the components, throw in static data, and then back end developers, we wanted to learn how to integrate these components. So this is a really simple example, but what if, for example, you have some stuff coming from props, but you might also have something coming from another data source, and you have to make an API call. So the backend developer would write the API route, write the code in Next.js in the repository, and get all of your data, and then pass it again into the props. So if you think about it that way, it was really similar to like a classic, .NET MVC like workflow. Front end makes up like the prototype, then you take that, you cut it apart, you process in your data, and then you have a fully fleshed out component. And then you'll see here, I think at the time of when I did this, you were able to customize it. I think it might not be customizable anymore, or maybe there's a way to customize it that I don't know of yet. But underneath the components folder is where Sitecore will look for your components. So there's a concept of this like bootstrap TS that runs at build time and like generates a bunch of configurations and stuff. So from a very simple, understanding of it, just to make it simple, it will look in this components folder and look for any TSX component that is in there. And then that's how it maps your component from Sitecore to XM Cloud. So the next topic I want to talk about is code deployment. So as far as code deployment goes, most of the write-ups and stuff that I was reading at the time, keep in mind I started working on the site maybe a good 9 months ago or something like that. Everything was in like GitHub or publicly available. So one of the things that we noticed right away is, most of our clients don't have publicly hosted code. They have privately hosted code. So a common thing for us is Azure DevOps. So we integrated with Azure DevOps. And then something that's different here is the build doesn't really happen anymore in your build and deploy and release pipelines. The build actually happens on each of the respective platforms themselves. So like Vercel's build happens in Vercel, XM Cloud's build happens in XM Cloud. So really, like for us, Azure DevOps just kind of became like an artifact creator. You can do more in there, like we were running lint and running some other code checks and stuff like that in the build process, but pretty much it was just like an artifact builder for us. And you leverage the Sitecore CLI and the Vercel CLI to do the deployment. So I know you can build your deployments with the templates and stuff, but I chose to do it this way just so I could walk through it and explain it. So essentially what we're doing here is you'll see in the contents we're doing ** and the target folder is build XM Cloud. Essentially, I'm taking every single thing in our repository and dumping it into an XM Cloud folder. And why that's important is XM Cloud, while it is your CMS and it needs all your Sitecore code. So like from a XM Cloud project perspective, we have like kind of three main key ideas. We have the SES structure, our platform, which is essentially like your CMS. So think of it as like, our .NET code for Sitecore itself. And then you have your app, your application, your headless app. You actually need to deploy your headless application to Sitecore XM Cloud as well, because XM Cloud has an internal rendering host. I should say you don't have to, but Sitecore has made it so you can. So what that means is when you deploy to XM Cloud, you're essentially giving it your entire repository, inclusive of your SES files, your headless application, and your any custom like Sitecore code or configurations that you might have. So when you use Experience Editor in XM Cloud, or if you use Pages in XM Cloud, you're actually looking at a locally hosted in XM Cloud itself version of your rendering host, which is actually pretty cool. So then you don't have to worry about, managing that out in Vercel and, maybe locking stuff down and traffic and stuff like that. It's just pretty cool. So back to what I'm talking about here, we've built out our XM Cloud package. You see my next two steps. We publish the XM Cloud artifact. And then here, the path to publish is just the source/app. So it's just the headless front-end application. So we've made two packages, two artifacts rather. One, which is the whole repo, inclusive of SES, XM Cloud, and the headless application. And one that's just everything in our Next.js headless application. Those are our two artifacts. And that's the whole build pipeline for like a very simple, like, hello world example. You can run other things here, like, we ended up implementing lint and some other checks here, and some other stuff is happening that you can help improve your process. You can still do anything that you would have ran before, but as you can see, like, you don't need to, run Node or do your CSS compilation or do any of that stuff, because it all happens in XM Cloud or Vercel. So then this is our release pipeline. Again, this is like a pretty simple, like, hello world kind of example, but you'll see my release pipeline is two steps. One is to deploy to XM Cloud, and one is to deploy to Vercel. And then you'll see here, it's on the XM Cloud step, it's just two steps. One thing to note, and it tripped me up a little bit, and I needed to take some time to figure this out, but the .NET Core SDK is a requirement of the Sitecore CLI. So making sure you have it within your pipeline is really important. So that's the first step. And then right here, we are just using the out-of-the-box Sitecore CLI. So you'll see .NET tool restore. So this is just restoring the tool set, and then we use .NET Sitecore Cloud Login. You'll see we pass in client credentials. We give it a client ID and a client secret. So if you go to the XM Cloud Deploy app, you can generate that ID and that secret. I think it's under environments and then variables, but it's in the XM Cloud Deploy app. There's documentation on it. And then you run the command .NET Sitecore Cloud Deployment Create. You pass the working directory as dot, so it's everything here, because again, you need everything to go out to XM Cloud. And you give it an environment ID. And that environment ID is also something you can grab from the XM Cloud Deploy app. And then just something I want to make note of is when you do this deployment, anything that's in your SCS folder or your SCS structure, your module JSON, gets made as an item as a resource when the image is being created for your XM Cloud instance. So it gets like baked into the creation of that XM Cloud that happens at build time. So it's important to just keep structural things in there. Like you don't want content, you don't want stuff like that in there, because if maybe you had something in there and then you made a child item in content, and then you maybe deleted something, and you might have something that's reading from IAR, but it might not actually be in the master database, or you might have some orphan data, or you might need to redeploy to say you deleted some content, you might need to redeploy out, make sure that content is removed from SCS, and then redeploy out. So I would just say from like mistakes and working through this myself, I would highly recommend no content in your SCS modules if you can. If you do need to put content in your SCS modules, there is a way to exclude them from the XM Cloud deploy. I believe it's in the XM Cloud deploy.json, and you can specify to not include a package. So something that we did is we wanted a bunch of stuff locally for a developer. So like say we had a site and the site was built with a header and a footer and some sample pages. We don't want everyone to create that every time, and we don't want to package it up. So we made a new module JSON and called it like zzz dot local content dot module dot JSON, and in that XM Cloud deploy dot JSON, you can specify to omit that from the deployment. So that would be the approach that you would want to take. And then here, this is the second task. So just to go back here, so Vercel. So this is the second task. And again, this is using the Vercel API, the Vercel CLI. So pretty straightforward. It's in the Vercel documentation, but you just run npm I g Vercel and then Vercel deploy, and you give it a token. You make that token on your user account. Something that we did was make like an administrative user account, and that administrative user account has the token associated with it. So it's not like Jared's user account in that example. And then two of the other things to note is you need the org ID and the project ID. This Vercel deploy command is expecting the variables Vercel org ID and Vercel project ID within the call. So I just set them up as variables in the pipeline, and then I just place my values in there. And you can get those org IDs and those project IDs out of Vercel itself, or when you create your Vercel project the first time using the CLI, it'll make a essentially what you do is you run the same command. You'd say like npm ig Vercel. So here, let me take a step back. So like from your front end application, say this is the very first time you are setting up a project in Vercel, because it's in a private repo, so you can't hook it up to Vercel because it's a private repo. So the workflow for that is you would go into your headless application, in the root of your headless application, you would do npm I g Vercel, and then you'd run Vercel. And when you run Vercel, it'll ask you a bunch of questions about pushing your code out there, setting up a new project, linking it to an existing project, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll walk through it. And then eventually it will create a .vercel folder in your app root, and that will have your org ID and your project ID. So like theoretically, you can also like redeploy, you can deploy to Vercel locally from your code base if you need to. So sometimes that was something I needed to do just to, say you don't want to go through all the pipelines and the process and you're just trying to fix something quickly on dev. You might want to just, deploy that way. And it's the same commands and stuff that you see here. And then something else I just want to talk about is I just been getting a lot of questions on this where the XM Cloud deploy app, it has a lot of logs. When you go in here, you can view the regular log. There's the rendering host log, because like I said, there is a locally hosted rendering host within XM Cloud. And then you can click through here and help you debug. So like if your deployment's not going well, there is the regular deployment log from, Azure DevOps that might give you some information, but it's really just a send it off and be done. So you can come in here and there's a deployment log that you can look at, which sometimes might give you information. On the top left, you'll see it says deployments. And then if you find the specific deployment, you can find the actual deployment log. But where I would get all of the most of my information out of and when something was actually failing would be in here. So you would come to the most recent deployment, come in here, and on the top, you'll see I hit CM instance logs because I was specific to finding an error on the CM, and then you can grab your log data here. So that was pretty helpful. And then similarly in Vercel, you can do the, something similarly. They have logs there too. So you can come into the deployment that you're on, and then you can go into the deployment details. You can see the logs, you can see what pages were statically generated. I'll get into that a little bit later. And just a bunch of information here to help you debug if you need to. So super, super valuable. The next thing I want to just talk about is the multi-site plugin. So all of the sites in this project all shared. We had a couple common themes, like I said, but all of the components are used across all of them. So, most of their homepages look the same. There are things that are a little different across all of them, but it was a really good fit for the multi-site plugin. And, coincidentally, like I said, Sitecore is always like building things as you're going. The multi-site plugin came in during my development of this. So I started going down a different approach, and then the multi-site plugin was released maybe a couple months into this project. So I went down the road of using it. So without diving a ton of detail into it, what you need to know is there's this Bootstrap TS that I've talked about before, which generates like your configurations. It generates more than just this, but just to simplify it for the needs of this project. Line 11, at build time, your config.sites gets generated. So if you have one site, you could hard code that value in there and you'll be fine. But if you're using the multi-site, so you have two sites, in an extreme scenario like mine, you might have 300 sites, 310 sites. We add new sites all the time. That maps, so you see it says name foo, hostname foo.com. It just looks at your settings item in the tree, and then where your URL and your hostname, your target hostname, and everything is configured, and it maps it that way. So it knows if the request comes in for foo.com, it knows it's the site foo. So that's how it handles it. The key caveat here is this gets built at build time. So I'll get into this a little bit more, but if you add a new site, that means you need to rebuild your front-end application for the config.sites to have that proper data. The config.sites data comes from Experience Edge, from a Sitecore library that calls your sites. It's a GraphQL query that gets all your site info. I think it might be called site info. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but that's how the sites array gets populated. So for this project specifically, we had a requirement where, up to 10 sites could be added a month. So although it was 300 sites when we migrated them and created them, I think it's above that now. They add new ones all the time. So like I just said, I needed a way to redeploy to Vercel from Sitecore. And if you're an architect or developer, that sounds kind of scary to allow your content authors to rebuild your code. So I had a kind of a creative way around that. And my creative way around that was, sorry, I should show this first. I added a new script. We added quite a few new scripts just because of the nature of this project. There's just a lot of sites, so we made a lot of like Sitecore PowerShell extension helper things to use. But deploy to Vercel is one of those scripts. So when you are on a site, this is just my demo site, so there's only one site in there, but there'd be 300 in here in like production, and you would click on any one of those sites and you could click deploy to Vercel. When you hit deploy to Vercel, everything gets built out and sent out there. But it's important because when you hit deploy to Vercel on one specific site, it knows to take the context of the URL and the domain configuration for that site. So my PowerShell script, first I'll say we're leveraging the Vercel REST API. I did not see a way to redeploy to Vercel from the CLI. I wanted to make sure that we redeployed the last successful release. I didn't feel comfortable letting nothing against content authors, but I didn't want to let a content author deploy brand new code. Like the chances of something breaking or something happening just seemed too risky. So my workaround was I was reading through the Vercel REST API and I saw that you could do a redeployment. So, and you can redeploy by ID. So if you look at my PowerShell script here, we set some variables, we give it some tokens, some project names, project IDs, team ID, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see it says, sorry, I don't have numbers on this, but it says current site definition. So that's where it gets your site definition item. So like based on the context of where you're at, it can figure out what is my domain name, what is my host name, et cetera. And then it uses all of that to get the latest deployment ID, add a new domain. So like, I don't really dive into it here, but by default, you can have as many Vercel URLs as you want within your production. I probably shouldn't say as you want. I'm sure there's a limit to it and a number, but for the 300 that we've done, we haven't had any issues. So I'm sure there's like maybe a cost above a certain amount. I want to say it's something that's like we had like 10,000 domains allowed or something like that, but some number you probably won't get to. So we get the latest deployment ID, we add a domain. So like our workflow was to allow content authors to spin up a site. And then when we spin up a site, we automatically set the host name and the site grouping to a Vercel URL. So it can be like star.vercel.app. And we would make it like the site name dash, client project name .vercel.app. So essentially what we did here is we got the latest deployment ID. We would then add a new domain to Vercel based on what we see in Sitecore and then redeploy. So the only caveat here is if you're going to make a new site and you want it to show up, you would make a new site, publish it out to Experience Edge, and then after you've published it out to Experience Edge with all the right settings and everything set, you would run the script. And then that site would be live. So then this is just me digging in a little bit more. So to get the latest deployment ID, again, I'm just using the Vercel REST API calls. I'm passing it some parameters and it's spitting back the latest deployment ID. So I get the most recent successful deployment ID. So that way I'm just redeploying something that was already tried and true and successfully out there. I'm not rebuilding our code from scratch. You see I have another call here to get the deployment status. so I can get the most successful deployment, the most recent successful deployment. And then the first function, redeploy by ID, that's how I'm actually doing the deployment. And then you'll see here, there's an add new domain call. So that's just how I'm dynamically adding domains to Vercel. That's also the workflow that we use for if a client is, having a new DNS record or something on their own. They essentially all they have to do is work with their DNS team to hook it up to Vercel, and then publish to Experience Edge, do this workflow, with the deploy to Vercel script, and then the site will be live and working. And something really cool about Vercel is it'll automatically it uses Let's Encrypt, and it'll make an SSL cert for you automatically, and it will also recreate that cert every, I don't know if it was 14 days, 30 days, etc. But it handles all of that for you. So if your client wants to use a custom cert, they absolutely can, and you can put it in there. But managing 300 certs across unique domains certainly has its challenges. So using Let's Encrypt and the SSL certs that can happen automatically through Vercel was a real big benefit for this project. So Sitecore search. I'm just going to focus on the multi-site portion that we used. Bala and team on the call here and the user group here already did a really good Sitecore search walkthrough. It's on YouTube. I recommend you watch it if you haven't already. But all I wanted to focus on is like, well, with Sitecore search, how did I make it work for multi-site? So if you have 300 sites or 300 sites and counting, and you want to have them in Sitecore search, it's really impractical to make one source per each site, because that way, if a new site was made, someone needs to add a new source in Sitecore search, and it just didn't seem like a practical solution. So what we ended up doing was setting up a trigger for the source using a sitemap index. And if you're not familiar with the sitemap index, a sitemap index is just a collection of sitemaps. And then rather than manually making that, we added a new additional sitemap index rewrite rule. So we just piggybacked on top of the current sitemap route. And then you'll see on line 9, we just put in our own. So essentially, like, you can go to any of the 300 sites URLs /sitemap_index.xml, and it redirects you to API sitemap index. And then in our API sitemap index right here, you'll see that we actually have some code. And what this code does here is it does as it says. It puts together your sitemap index, but you'll see on line 18, search site settings info cache. That's actually a call to our API, and then our API. So you'll see on line 3 up top, you'll see it says source repository sitemap index API. That's actually a call to our API. And then behind the scenes, we're using like React query to cache if we need to cache this, so we don't have to do it all the time. I have another slide where we'll get into some caching and stuff like that. But you can see we just have a GraphQL request under the hood. So you could do proper paging and get all of them, but you'll see it says search first 999. We just made the assumption for now that we're not going to have more than 1,000 sites. So just going back one more time, you can see that we return a response on line 33, and it's just the sitemap index, and the sitemap links are coming from the site info on line 18, and the site info is using our internal API, and then our internal API is leveraging React query, and then under the hood, it's just using this GraphQL query to get all that data. So it comes right out of Experience Edge. So with all that said, that is what allowed us to use one sitemap index in a way that lets us dynamically add more sites to our collection. So like anytime we added a new site and that site was published out to Experience Edge, caching aside, there might be some time where this query is not the most updated because it is cached. So, we'll get into that into a further slide, but you only had to set up one sitemap index in Sitecore search, and you point to that one sitemap index. And now we had a way to dynamically have as many sites, it should say asterisk 999, up to 999 sites out there. And then I didn't put in this presentation, but again, if you look at like Bala's presentation on YouTube for Sitecore search, we added a field called source, and we just take the URL. So when it crawls all of the sitemaps in the sitemap index, and then it goes to the first sitemap, for example, and then crawls all the pages on that sitemap, we are looking at the URL, and on every item in our one source in Sitecore search, we are setting a source to that URL. We do some like cleanup on the URL so it looks nice, but using that source in that field makes it so we can have a settings item in our site itself that says, this is my site URL. So then we know when we leverage our search to only return results where the field in that source matches the URL of the site name. So essentially what we did was create a way to allow a dynamic amount of sites to work out of the box within XM Cloud in Sitecore search, but we don't need any additional configuration in Sitecore search. Some other things I want to talk about for Next.js and Vercel considerations, and I might, yeah. And so I talked about this actually already, but we leveraged the Vercel CLI to create a new project from a private repo. So out of the box, there's, at least at the time, there was no way to say, hey, let me take this private repo and hook it up. You have to run those commands from your app, so your headless application, and then follow the on-screen instructions and create a new project. And we have one project per environment because you are allowed custom URLs per production slot of each environment. So essentially we made a dev, a QA, and a prod project in Vercel, and each one of them has a production slot, and we leverage each one of their production slots so we can have a static URL in there. So it could be dev.projectname.com, something like that, and prod.projectname.com, etc. They have Vercel does have other slots that you can leverage, but they have preview slots, but they will have dynamic URLs at build time. So it's not always something you can leverage with Sitecore because you need to know the static URL for that environment. It works really well for like front end though, if you want to, spin up a PR and push it out there to a preview, and you want to just look at some static front end stuff. It's a pretty good scenario. Another big thing that we encountered was Vercel gating. So Vercel has some really cool stuff built in where you can use single sign-on, or you could use basic auth to lock down the environment. So essentially, anytime someone comes to the front end of your site, it might ask you for a password or might ask you to log in, which is great because you can, you no longer have to worry about someone coming to your dev site or locking it down with proper firewall rules and stuff, because it's out in the cloud. You don't have to worry about getting a WAF in place and maybe like additional features or a static IP with Vercel. But to use that, we found out that all of our assets weren't working properly when we locked out the other when we locked up the lower environments. We didn't notice it on prod because there's no lockdown on prod. Prod's always open. But what we realized was if you make your asset prefix, so that in the next config, your asset prefix, which is pretty much what, if you're going to load your JavaScript or your CSS, it's what the beginning of that URL is. By default, the next config uses the public URL, so it would be a fully qualified URL. There's a requirement in XM Cloud for Experience Editor and for your for pages that a fully qualified public URL needs to be there. But that is not a requirement for Vercel. So what we ended up doing was making an XM Cloud default rendering host variable in XM Cloud itself. And when you make an environment variable through the deploy app in XM Cloud, you can you can specify if you want it to just be on the rendering host, or if you want it to be an XM Cloud, or if you want like both. So we just said we want it to be on the rendering host, and then we set it to true. So what that means is when it's XM Cloud default rendering host, use the public URL, otherwise use undefined. And if it's undefined, it'll just be a relative path. So that was a big gotcha that took us a little bit to figure out, but that's the magic to getting Vercel to be able to lock down in your lower environments. And then one big gotcha, and I'll get into it in a future slide, is 45 minutes max build time. I know that might seem silly because, you know, maybe that's a lot of time, but when you're doing 300 sites, you can get to that 45 max minute pretty fast. And there's nothing you can do about that. Vercel will time out 45 minutes. I think one time it went to 46 because I was lucky, but it will always time out. So there's some considerations and things just to know. And then this in itself, this is a pretty big topic. So experience edge, GraphQL, static site generation, etc. So like, how are we using that all together? What does it mean, and what do we do? So some key highlights that I put out here is you can use GraphQL. There's a rendering field on a rendering. As by the name. So like each rendering has a GraphQL rendering field, and you can put a GraphQL query in there. But that's something I would recommend for like, you know, simple components, maybe an RTE, a CTE, a CTA, a callout, something really simple where there's not a lot of logic, because you can't have any like caching there. You're not leveraging any variables. It's just really simple use case. But for like header and navigation and stuff like that, you really want to put your GraphQL query into your headless application, and then leverage, like I said, like React query for caching, and use something like that in that kind of scenario. Something to note is you only can have 80 calls per second to edge for your GraphQL data. That's a hard limit in Sitecore. You will encounter that during your build process. You could encounter that just while people are navigating to your site. We've already talked about the 45 minutes in Vercel, and then static site generation, server-side props, and then incremental static regeneration. So I'm going to dig into that in a second. And then on-demand revalidation is something I'm going to look at in the future. So what we did for this project was we used GraphQL, the rendering fields for very simple components, like I said, and then for more complex cases, we used React query, and the query gets called from an API route within our headless application. And then to dig into SSG, so static site generation, just to simplify it, is when GraphQL calls happen at build time. Whereas SSR, server-side props, is when the data from GraphQL happens at page load time, right? So since we have 300 sites with all of these pages, and we have this 80 calls per second to edge for GraphQL data, we don't want to leverage SSR. We can't have it anytime anyone comes to these 300 sites, it calls GraphQL to get that data. So we wanted to use static site generation, right? So which is server-side prop. We wanted to use static site generation, which is get static props. So that's great, and that worked out well, except for the fact that Vercel has a 45-minute hard stop. So when we're using, we use the sitemap service to crawl all the pages and generate the static props. But at 300 sites, it was taking quite a bit of time, and it would time out and never finish. So it could never statically generate all of our pages on our site before that 45 on a. Sorry, it could never statically generate all of the pages on all of our sites before it hit that 45-minute window in Vercel. So really what it comes down to is, how can we manage our time for this Vercel build in the 45-minute constraints, as well as our 80 calls per second to edge for GraphQL restraints. So what we did was we modified the GraphQL sitemap service, and you can modify it two ways. You can either say these are the pages that I want you to crawl, or you can say these are the pages I don't want you to crawl. We picked the latter approach. So we said these are the pages we don't want to crawl. So we picked out everything across all of the sites that's just like boilerplate stuff that analytics was saying, you know, people weren't going to these, like, you know, maybe privacy policy, 404 page, you know, legal stuff like that, where people weren't going to it. And then we could focus our static site generation on just the pages that matter, like homepage, search, about us, doctor listings, stuff like that. So that made our build significantly faster, and then it allowed us to use static site generation. And then there's another concept called incremental static regeneration. So because our code is at build time calling GraphQL and getting all of our data, what happens if that data changes? And that data changes, you know, an hour after you did your deployment. You don't want to redeploy your code. You don't want to do a whole new deployment. So by default, the Sitecore headless starter repo sets it to 5 seconds. But what happens is every 5 seconds, it'll check to see if the data has changed in Experience Edge. And if it does, it'll static site generate that page. But if you allow it to do that every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds, you could see how, you know, you might hit that 80 call per second to edge for your GraphQL data again. Because like, it's important to note that like every time you load a page, it's not just one GraphQL data call. You might have one for the dictionary. You might have one for like layout service data. You might have one per each component. So, you know, it wouldn't be uncommon to have 5 calls on a page. So if you're letting people incrementally static regenerate every 5 seconds based on if they hit a URL, you'll also hit that 80 calls per second pretty fast. So what we ended up doing is working with the client and figuring out, well, what's an acceptable time? So the acceptable time was 2 hours. So what that means is if you publish some content, the max amount of time that it could be wrong until the next person loads that page is 2 hours. So say you change something in your header, you go to that page. If you go to that page in 2 hours from now and go to it again, it'll re-static generate that page, throw it back in the cache, and the next time someone goes to it, it's pulling from the cache. So just working with the client to figure out what is an acceptable amount of ISR time was pretty key here. In my experience, you know, we always had some sort of publishing that happened, you know, at a given time. So, you know, maybe you'd have publishing 2 times a day or something like that, where, you know, we wouldn't always just let content authors publish whenever. So this client was already kind of familiar with like a workflow like that. So it was an easy talk and an easy discussion. And then something to look into next time that I didn't do on this project, but there's something called on-demand revalidation. So essentially, when you publish something and it's to Experience Edge and it's no longer what is out there, it will target that page specifically and revalidate. So for the requirements of this project, it wasn't something that I needed to do, but that's definitely an option, and that's something I'm going to look into for, you know, for the next project. Couple quick slides here. This is just me talking about showing the set static paths and the ISR time. So this is in the path TSX, which is where we set the get static props, and we have our revalidate on line 165, and I set it as an environment variable, but it's at 2 hours. And then this is the site info service. What is this called? Multi-site GraphQL sitemap service. And this is how I'm excluding. So you'll see underneath sites, it says excluded paths. I think the other variant is allowed paths or included paths. It might be included paths. but this was my approach. One of the limitations of this is it has to be name. Like it has to be about your surgery, or it has to look for something in the URL to make it work. So for me, in my scenario, with 300 sites, we knew that, on every site, we don't care about sitemap or privacy policy or about your surgery, being statically generated. And I will say, because it's a Next.js site, it was really hard to even notice the difference. Like if it was static generated or if it wasn't, everything's going to load really fast. If you had maybe some really intense amount of components, or you had some really intense GraphQL queries, you might see some of that stuff. But even on our physicians page, where we load on 100 doctors or something with a GraphQL query, it's still pretty fast. So that's how we worked around it. And then I know I'm almost out of time, but I'll talk on content migration. I think it's my last topic, if everyone will allow. For content migration, this was my approach. And if you want some more detail on this, you can also check out like my blog. My blog is just my name, jaredornofsky.vercel.app. I go into a lot of the topics like in this presentation, maybe a little bit in more detail, but there's a post there on this. But essentially what I did was I took this 7.2 database and I made a backup. I asked the client to give me a backup of that database. And once I got a prod master database, I was able to put that database in our Docker data SQL folder, right? So it could be a backpack. I think it was a backpack. It could be a BAK file, whatever it is. And then what I did was I went into Docker. I found the ID of my SQL instance. And then if you run this command in the command line, you can figure out the IP of that SQL instance. Then I restored that database in SQL Management Studio with the credentials in my env file. I think it gives you like your SQL admin password and username in there. And then what I did is I added a new database target locally to XM Cloud, the platform project. So like what we're doing here is just think about this as just regular old Sitecore if I was going to add another database target. It's important to note, like you cannot do this with XM Cloud, like in your dev or QA or prod instances, but with Docker locally, you can. So that's the key distinction here. So in my app config folder, I created a connection string copying the base example from the Docker file system, and then I added a new master legacy connection string. And then again, this is like for those of you who have been doing Sitecore for a long time, I just added in my app config include in my platform project, I just made a new database config patch called legacy master config, just out of the box, and hook it up to that database. And then now that database shows up as a target in my local XM Cloud Docker environment. So then what we did is we have some internal tools, some internal things that we've been using in Sitecore for years to do content migration. We were able to just use them. So like if you have some PowerShell scripts, we also did PowerShell scripts here too. If you have your regular old stuff that you were doing in older Sitecore environments using PowerShell to migrate content, those all apply here. You can still all use them locally. The key word there is locally. So what we did here is we migrated the content from the legacy source to the new source. We transformed the old pages, the templates, the data sources, made any new rules, whatever we had to do, and then we just did it through PowerShell scripts. So, rather than showing any examples here, it's nothing new. It's the same way we would have done it in the old Sitecore world. And, probably like myself, you probably have some stuff saved and you're able to reuse some tools and stuff there. Once your stuff is in the master database on your local and no longer in the legacy master, so it's been transformed, combined, extracted, what have you, and it's ready to go, then I just leverage Sitecore content serialization to put that content into groups. So say I had 300 sites. If I tried to make one module file with all of the sites, it would just 529 or timeout, gateway crash, XM Cloud. There's actually one time where I actually crashed my XM Cloud a couple times. So like the actual XM Cloud when I tried to push some data. So what I ended up doing here was I just created a script that you see on the bottom. It says build module JSON skip 0 select 10. I just built a way so after everything was migrated on my local and I had the 300 sites and everything was migrated and it's just ready to get pushed up to XM Cloud, like your prod instance or your dev instance. I just wrote this script so that I could dynamically grab groups of sites into its own module JSON. So you'll see here, like what my approach was is I made a folder called like prod, and I had migration 0.module, migration 1.module, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. And then I had like, I think I did like 10 or 50 at a time. And you just disable everything and you run your Sitecore CLI command. So .NET Sitecore serialization pull will pull everything on your local. So that's your transformed local migrated content. And then you can run .NET Sitecore serialization push and then your prod. And then it would take that data and push it out to production. If you're not familiar, you can use Sitecore CLI Connect. You can use the Sitecore CLI to connect to a new environment. You can do prod, dev, any of your environments that exist, but it's just a simple CLI command. You would say .NET Sitecore Cloud Login, and then I think it's environment connect, and then you give it an ID and you say allow write. And then that gets saved into your user.json. So then in the future, you can run like .NET Sitecore serialization push prod, and then it'll take your data that is on your local, and then it'll push that JSON file. That JSON file rather will push all of your serialized objects to your production environment. So I use that approach. So like with enabling and disabling it, and again, I did not commit any of this to version control. You don't want these things in version control. You just want to utilize them locally so that you can push the content out to prod. And yeah, that's so I said a lot of stuff. I talked through a lot of things. There's probably certain topics that I could have be their own presentation, but my main goal was to just share my knowledge and share what I've learned and what I've worked on and how I can help you all, start working on your XM Cloud projects or maybe your current projects. But yeah, Q&A, and it's my thank you. But if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Gerard. It was really insightful. I had a few questions. One is like how much, like I just wanted to check what was the timeline for how was your first site, how much time you took, and then to scale it to 300, like how much time you was.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the project was about 9 months. There was a little bit of discovery in the beginning, so that there was that too. I will be honest with you, the components were easier than the content migration. Figuring out the content migration was definitely the hardest part. But I think that goes with every Sitecore site. Like migrating the content is always the part that you need to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's. But yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, schedule publishing is publishing. Can you schedule publishing? Do the schedule publishing?
I think so. To be honest, I haven't used it, but I think you can.
Okay. Thanks, man.
Yeah, and some other things that I know you can still do is like you can have a task run. You can still do a scheduled task. We were using those for some things. Just something worth noting.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it possible to use custom identity providers with XM Cloud?
Yeah. So with Vercel, you can implement your own, and with XM Cloud, they now have like SSO providers that you can use out of the box. I haven't implemented it on this project because it wasn't out when we were doing this, but I do know there are some limitations to it right now. for example, like if you want role-based stuff to happen, I don't think that works right now with the XM Cloud part. But I do think that's on their roadmap and something they're working on.
The other cool feature which you said was content author creating their own websites. So how, like, do they need to be a bit techy, or now is it like they can create it with help of some technical staff or something like that? How
Yeah,
automated?
so this site is headless SXA.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I leveraged, I think I could have made a whole presentation about the site factory that we created. I tried to keep it like very XM Cloud centric and
yeah,
not about the site factory. But how we do that is we have a source site, and that source site has, all of your pages in it and everything, and it lives somewhere in the content tree in a global location. But every single site is, and I think some people, might make a face, but every single site is a clone of that source site. And then all of the clone sites then have abilities to overwrite their final presentation details, and you can add new things. You can re-inherit from the source site. You can have net new pages, and then we built a whole suite of PowerShell scripts and tools that let you promote that content and manage that content amongst those 300 sites. So in our scenario for this project, a lot of the sites are very similar. So there will be like unique content and stuff like that across, but there's,
yeah.
The same 100 pages are going to be the same 100 pages, but we leverage tokens for individualized content. So we would use tokens for like address, locations, etc., stuff like that. And then we wrote like a wrapper class around our like RTE component, and then we would just do token replacing on that. As far as how content authors can handle it, we again just expose some PowerShell scripts using Sitecore PowerShell extensions. So a user would go into the sites node, which in the content editor is where all the sites live, and you would just right click and you'd say insert new site, and then it gives you like a pop-up, and there's like 3 panels of data that you enter, and you can enter in all your token information, what captcha are you using, what's your domain name, all of the basic information you need. You click that, and then 3 minutes later you have a site built with all your default content. Then you can go through and add more stuff to it, remove stuff from it, et cetera, and then you go through that workflow of publishing it to Experience Edge and then deploying to Vercel. So the only thing you need a technical person for is the DNS setup. And the DNS setup is always the same for Vercel for every single site. So once the client, has identified whoever on their team is going to handle that DNS, the content authors have been able to make, a good amount of sites, and, they haven't asked us for any help. So they're able to add those 10 new sites every month without a problem.
Pretty cool. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
So Jared, one question. In the Azure CI/CD pipeline, there was 2 tasks, right? One for XM Cloud and the second for Vercel. But in this case, we have only one repo. So is there any different artifacts were deployed on XM Cloud and different on a Vercel?
Yep. So let me show you that. So like originally we make 2 artifacts. So our XM Cloud artifact is everything in the repo, and everything in the repo means Sitecore content serialization, your platform, which is XM Cloud. So think of it as like your .NET code, and then your rendering host, your app, your headless application. So those 3 components all get put into the XM Cloud artifact because XM Cloud hosts a local rendering host. And then Vercel, let me go to that side. Then Vercel is just what's in your app. So source/app. So it's just your headless application. So you have 2 artifacts. You have one with everything in the repo, which is needed for XM Cloud, and one that is just your Next.js application, which is needed for Vercel. And then here in your release pipeline, you have in your stage, you have two deployment processes. One that uses the CLI for Sitecore to deploy that one specific package for XM Cloud. And then one here that deploys the very specific package for Vercel, which is just your headless application to Vercel using that CLI.
Okay, got it. But still that the package for Vercel, that is still from our repo itself, right?
Yeah, so like the repo itself has everything in it. Your repo is, if you base it off of the Sitecore XM Cloud starter repo, I mean, you don't have to do it this way, but it's what Sitecore recommends. If you take that starter repo, it's your headless application, your SES, and your XM Cloud platform code all within one repo. But there's no reason why you can't take another repo for your headless application and throw it into here.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Have any more questions for Jared?
Hey, hi. I have one general question around XM Cloud.
Sure.
Is it possible for e-commerce site to be built on an XM Cloud? Would that be possible?
So for I guess it depends on what you're saying and what you're asking. XM Cloud is just the CMS. So like if your e-commerce stuff all lives in your Next.js application, that's just going to live in Vercel. So the answer would be yes. So like without knowing what you're building and what you're doing, it's hard to say, but XM Cloud itself is just your CMS in Experience Edge. Everything else would be in your headless application, which in my scenario is Next.js. So I don't see why it couldn't be in there. But to say it lives in XM Cloud, I don't believe would be the right way of saying it.
Okay. Okay. So currently the XM Cloud doesn't support any of the general SXA commerce components, correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. But I'm not an e-commerce expert, so I wouldn't take what I'm saying there as 100%. But those would be the type of questions, like if you're going to do an XM Cloud project, you would work with your technical partner advisor and bounce those questions off. But there's no traditional, like everything has to be a headless component to work within XM Cloud. Everything has to be headless. So if it used to work on old Sitecore and it's not headless, it's probably not going to work. Is my guess.
Okay. Yeah. That is
A
helpful.
quick question, Jared. Hi. Quick question, Jared. So this was it looks to me like a big bang approach, wherein you took a customer from a Sitecore on-prem or maybe a PaaS into XM Cloud, right? And using React.js and Vercel. So I think everything, what is like new and cutting edge is what you migrated this customers onto. Now, based on your experience and like the time you took for everything, discovery and front-end components, and then the content migration, which you said was pretty challenging for you or for your team, do you still recommend this to your customers, or would you maybe recommend a phased approach wherein you take like a staged approach when you do the headless first and then move to XM Cloud, or rather you still recommend the big bang approach which you did for this project of yours?
That's a really good question. I think it's going to be client by client specific. So there's another project I'm working on right now where we are building out one certain part of the project in XM Cloud first. Certain clients are going to have certain appetite to let you do something like this, and the timeline and the time frame to even get it accomplished and meet those stakeholders. Those stakeholders like requirements of when things need to go live is probably going to be what impacts that decision. As far as doing this all at once, I don't have any regrets or issues with doing this all at once. I think it was a good approach for this client, and if we were going to do something again and it was phased approach versus not phased approach, and there were no like requirements or anything or leading to a phased approach, I would still do it this way. I would just like give you more time for the content migration. The content migration piece takes takes longer in this world than it did in the old XP world. I will say though, from working with Sitecore and working with the technical partners and being in conversations with some of the product team, like, you know, they want our feedback and they want to know some of the issues we're having. And I am told that there are some tools and stuff that are being worked on to help out content migration.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. And just quickly, you know, I hear that we need that hand holding because XM Cloud is so new to everyone. The partner or the expert you got from Sitecore, was it based on the accounts of American Eagle, or was it based on the customer's account? Like, I hear two different things in the market, that if you, as a partner, you might be having access to them. I don't know, I'm just saying level close free of cost. As a customer, it might be a charge. Do you see so?
So as a, oh, you're saying like if you're a customer, do you get a technical partner?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know because I've only ever been on the partner side. I know from the partner side, I got Rich, who's absolutely fantastic. If you ever have a chance to work with Rich, but I don't know like the inner workings of that. All I know is one day I was like, I'm doing this XM Cloud project, and then Rich was like, you're working with me, and that's all I know.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
great.
I can help you answer that. The PTA are typically assigned to the partner profile, so you get that. And with XM Cloud projects, typically you are assigned with what they call the TAM, technical account manager. So which they have a fixed amount of hours that you can utilize. So if you're a customer, you could use that time. But if you're a partner, you can use the PTA.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Bala. Appreciate that
So
insight.
is it billed to the partner, Balaji?
The PTA is not, it's not a billing, it's more like our partner benefit that we could use.
Yeah,
Partner.
And the TAM hours are something that is by default included in the XM Cloud projects, in the licensing that is already included. So that's something that you cannot skip.
and I will say that, like, say I'm on a couple XM Cloud projects now, like the same advisor, it's not the same advisor always across all the projects.
Any more questions to Jared?
The source was, I saw in my content migration, you said it is SQL to SQL. So I assume everything was in your source sites were, old sites were on Sitecore and not on other platforms.
Yeah, so like there was actually Sitecore 7.2 database that worked in XM Cloud locally, which is, you know, I didn't think it would work, but it worked. I got lucky on that one. But yeah, it was in Sitecore. We have some internal tools that we use locally that we've used over the years, just modules and stuff that we've used to like scrape content from HTML and stuff like that. You could use anything there. Essentially, like within Docker in your local environment, you can do whatever you need to do. So whatever approaches you may have used in the XP world, they're still valid. The only blocker really is you need to leverage the CLI and SES to get that content to upper environments. With that said, you will time out if you have a lot of content in there. I spent a lot of time getting content out there. So one of the big things, like my big takeaway for this is we need some better tooling to help us there with content migration.